So February is the month gaming really kicks off this year, with some big releases, and despite some unfortunate delays, here are 10 games you should still be excited for in the upcoming month. Quick PSA, I'm going to be doing a giveaway for all of these games every single month, so if there's any game in particular that you wish to participate for, comment the name of it down below. You only have to be a subscriber of the channel and leave a like on the video to enter. And we're getting a hell of a start already with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Dubbed as the medieval GTA, the sequel expands on everything that made the first game great. Namely, the game world will be twice as big, but will also feature almost no loading screens, except for when starting the game out or when changing the map. The combat also gets refined with new animations and more intuitive controls. Also added more weapon variety, including crossbows and firearms, with more emphasis on aggressive playstyle, while still retaining its realistic approach. But there's also new stuff like new crafting skills, such as blacksmithing, along returning ones, such as the alchemy. What's interesting is that the crime and judgment system also gets a nice revamp with some exciting new features, and from the looks of it, it's going to be a lot more historically accurate. They've even added physical punishments with longer lasting effects on your character, which sounds really interesting, but witnesses can also remember you now, and NPCs will generally be way more reactive than in the first game. Also, the studio promised a story with deeper, darker themes, challenging the player moral choices with significant consequences. The first game also had some major decisions that influenced certain quests and even some characters, but in the sequel, yeah, we're gonna be getting a lot more of that and a story that features multiple endings. Unfortunately, no direct carryover because only some of the skills from the first game will be retained in the second, and we'll also get to start our journey with new equipment and stats, but the devs did mention that there are ways in which the game will acknowledge our progression from the past. At number 2, we have Ambulance Live, a paramedic simulator. Now look, I'm not big on simulator games, but I can definitely see their appeal. Here you obviously play as a paramedic, driving around town and responding to emergencies, helping folks out and whatnot. It's like the ambulance missions from GTA made into their own game, but obviously with many other features on top. Now, the dev team has worked on similar projects in the past, but usually these types of games end up looking better than they actually play. Not saying that's the case here either. The city looks pretty promising, the gameplay looks fairly complex, the driving seems fun and with some good weight to it. Hopefully that's not just from the trailer, and you do need to know what you're doing when treating folks, so it does have a layer of complexity. All I know is that I would constantly mess up, so maybe looking to that extent of the gameplay as well if you're jumping in. At number 4, we have Alien Rogue Incursion on the Quest 3. Technically not a new game, it's been delayed to release on the Oculus Quest 3 for this year, but this means more time for bug fixes and performance improvements, which from initial reviews seems to be the biggest problem with the initial release. The game does look good, however, it's just that it lacks the animation polish to really get it where it needs to be. I do have a sweet spot for VR games because I think the tech, especially in terms of interactivity, is really cool, so I always root out for big projects, ambitious projects that come out for VR. It does feel like VR has been stagnating, however, for a while now, but every now and then there's this one big game that comes out that somehow draws you back in. Hopefully developer Servius can pull all of this off. Right after this, we're going to get Civilization 7. Firaxis has been making some drastic changes over here, some beloved by the fans, others maybe not so much, but it's definitely a bold new take nonetheless. On one side, you don't just get to play with a single civilization in any given playthrough any longer. Instead, the game now features a 3-age structure: Antiquity, Exploration, and Modern Age, where each civilization is exclusive to a specific age. On the other hand, leaders can now also be selected independently of civilizations, which can allow for a greater degree of strategic flexibility, especially now that the tech and the culture trees have also been a bit more streamlined. And most, if not all, features exclusive to the DLCs in the previous Civilization game will be added to the default one in 7, such as natural disasters and many more. Plus, there's a new mechanic called crisis events when transitioning from one age to the next, which lets you adopt new policies but also introduce new negative effects and challenges. Besides that, districts will now be split into urban and rural with limited building slots early on, but with the possibility of unlocking more as you progress. Also, builders are gone. Instead, you can now expand your city with new districts from the city management screen as your population grows, and many others that will probably make you really eager for Civilization 7, especially since now we also have a return to its more realistic art style. Also, speaking of relaunches, at number 5 we have The Legend of Heroes Trials Through Daybreak 2, which gets the English version in February. So JRPGs are more popular than ever, and the Trials series have only gotten better with each new game, and there are some big leaps being made compared to the first one here as well. Namely, story structure is vastly different, letting you choose which order to complete character arcs in. You also see a great expansion to the combats into, so now you have way more attack opportunities in battle. Namely, you can allocate quick arts to each characters now. You can also pull off cross charges when doing perfect dodges, plus other ways to combine elemental spells via dual arts and so on. You're going to have quite a bit of time to actually play around with some of these new mechanics. There's a demo coming out on January 24th, during which you can test some of these aspects out, including some of the pre-made parties, some early on levels, plus of course some of the starting chapters of the main story, but only the story progression will carry over to the full game if you're going to end up buying it. It doesn't stop here though. We also have Avowed, first announced during the Xbox Game Showcase back in 2020. Avowed is a primarily first-person fantasy action RPG from Obsidian Entertainment, and actually the company is on a roll in 2025. They don't just get to launch Avowed, but also Outer Worlds too. However, Avowed is set in the same universe as Pillars of Eternity. The story sends us to the living lands of Iora to investigate a mysterious plague known as the Dream Scourge. Just like Obsidian's previous work, Avowed is rich in narrative and will focus on dialogue options with profound consequences, as well as huge mix of action combat that involves the use of melee weapons, magic, and yes, even firearms. There's actually multiple skill trees that will facilitate much of that, though I wasn't keen too much at first on using magic in a first-person game. However, early previews were quite positive, plus there's also a third-person mode. The highlight here is that you're not constrained to one single playstyle, although that is still an option, but you can go ahead and have a complete freedom to mix and match spells and weapons however you see fit. It's not going to be open world, mind you, but will feature large open zones, different biomes, and will feature a rewarding exploration. Side quests and NPCs are also quite abundant, with many choices involving them. While romancing won't be a thing here, unfortunately, there are several companions to join the player's party, even featuring their own questlines and personality, of whom you can influence by the decisions that you make during these moments. Moving on to number 7, we have Lost Records, Bloom and Rage Part 1. Fans of Life is Strange will come to appreciate this, since it's pretty much the original studios with some of the original dev team from Life is Strange working on this one, so pretty much the studio going back to its roots. First showcased during 2023's The Game Awards, Lost Records features 4 former friends reuniting after 27 years. Some kind of supernatural force catches up to them, which is the reason why they reunite so much later, as part of recreating the story with choices and consequences. There's also only one playable character this time around, and the game gets released in 2 parts. So part 1 will launch in February and the second one will come out a month later in March. Moving on though, we also have spin-offs. Like a Dragon Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii is one of them, spin-off to the Like a Dragon series. Taking place 6 months after the events of Infinite Wealth, the story follows Goro Majima as the leading role. After getting stranded on the island near Hawaii and having lost his memories, he now leads his own pirate crew to discover hidden treasures. Now the game does feature new and returning combat modes. One is the returning Mad Dog style, utilizing speed, agility and flair to deliver precise yet powerful blows that stun your enemies into submission. Also the newly added Sea Dog style, which is a combat style using dual-wielding short swords and pistols, as well as a whole arsenal of pirate tools to take down your enemies. Outside of regular combat, players will also get to assemble their own pirate crew and explore the open seas on their own pirate ship, which I think is where I'm gonna spend most of my time in. And yes, naval combat will also be a thing. You don't just get to engage in combat with other ships, but there's also even more upgrades to make your own ship much better. It's very interesting to see how this game came out to be simply because the team did not want to waste the Hawaii location in just one game, but so far the premise looks really interesting and fun. This brings us to PGA Tour 2K25. This is the latest entry in the golf simulation franchise from HB Studios. Obviously, it features several advancements that previous games never had, including the new Evo swing mechanic that takes into account 4 components. So this includes contact with the ball, the rhythm, transition, and the swinging path, which measures and rewards or even penalizes you accordingly. Plus, there's new shot types, ball flights, roll physics, and obviously lots of visual improvements, and also more customization for the My Career mode. There's also a roster of 11 pros launching with the game, and the only one I know of is Tiger Woods. Basically, I'm not a pro on golf or anything, but I'm pretty certain that much of the biggest names in this sport are going to be present in the game at launch as well. Now, before we actually move on to the last and biggest game, we have a couple other entries that I wanted to talk about. One of them is Project Pantheon, which launches in closed alpha really soon. The reason I didn't cover this earlier in the video is because for now we don't really have any gameplay, and all we know is that it's being made by the Wolfson devs, and that game could have been so much better with a bit better support. All we know so far is that this is some kind of mix between Diablo, so top-down action, but with a dose of extraction gameplay. So they call it an extraction RPG, which is a bit on the nose if you ask me, but it somehow blends the dungeon crawling of Diablo with Escape from Tarkov gameplay. So that means multiple maps, PvP, VE matchups where you fight with other players and monsters likewise, grabbing the best gear possible and then extracting safely back at your base with your newfound spoils. It sounds interesting in concepts, definitely unique, but could also be a major point of pain. The last thing you will want in a top-down ARPG Diablo-style game is to not be sure if you go back home with the loot or not. Even more so when you factor in the typical RNG. But luckily there's going to be an alpha test starting really soon. It begins a bit earlier in Europe, pretty much late January, and then in the US it begins on February 1st. The other one, technically not a new game, but rather a remaster, but one that I'm personally quite excited about. It's Tomb Raider 4-6 Remaster, which is going to include The Last Revelation, Chronicles, and Angel of Darkness. Each of these games will feature improved visuals, higher frame rates, of course also modern controls, but also cut content, dialogues, and voice lines will be added. In fact, even changes to some of the gameplay portions, especially in Angel of Darkness. So some of the gameplay elements here that will be improved upon is especially Curtis. In some of the brief playable moments we're going to have with him in the game, he's going to get some new combat abilities. So he can now also shoot around corners, he can also wield the mythical blade, and also a whole slew of other options in there to make him a little bit better, or at least close to how Lara was controlling back then. Obviously, you will also have the option to basically swap between the classical and the modern controls and graphics if you want to go back to the old ones or just focus on the new ones. And obviously this brings us to the last but definitely not least on the list. February will finish off with a bang thanks to Monster Hunter Wilds. I don't think this even needs an introduction at this point, but if I learned anything from the recent beta is that Capcom really took the Monster Hunter series to whole new heights with this. First of all, the game is now fully open world and the core gameplay loop has been massively bumped in quality of life because of it. Just the fact that you don't need to return to the camp after finishing an expedition adds so much in terms of quality of life over here. Add to that the fact that the world genuinely feels alive, the creatures will dynamically spawn, dynamically get affected and influenced by weathers, and even apex predators spawning in more often as the inclemency moves in just makes the world feel so dangerous but so rewarding. Also, combat feels more refined than ever. Most weapons got a few extra moves designed to cover drawbacks they previously had, such as, for example, having focus strikes, which feel absolutely fantastic and also natural to the combat flow. Besides that, the character creation looked really good. You also get the Sacred Mount, which absolutely helps a ton in open world exploration. You can now also have 2 separate sets of weapons that you can freely switch, especially in combat, and much more. Really, some of these challenges over here are very fun and complex, and I cannot wait to see more of this game on February 28th.